Blog Talk Radio.
Welcome to the Institute for Personal Development, Kriya Yoga Ashram, where total consciousness is the new frontier.
Kriya Yoga is union of the individual with the divine. Join us as we explore the practices to initiate this process.
Good morning. Welcome to the Voice of Yoga. Let's Talk Consciousness. I am your hostess, Lisa Winton, and with me is Kenny Toy, also known as Swami Jayananda, founder of the Institute for Personal Development, located here in Hampton, New Hampshire. Good morning, Swami. Thank you for being here today. How are you?
Good morning. I'm doing pretty good today. How about you?
I'm doing pretty good today, too. Thanks for asking. And I want to thank you all for tuning in. So today on the Voice of Yoga, we have dedicated 12 shows to discussing the 12 signs of the Zodiac as a map leading to spiritual understanding. Each week focuses on the respective sign as an archetype used in the process of an individual becoming divine. Listen this week as we explain the function of Leo as a stepping stone from my personal will to the one divine will. These shows will explore why divine law cannot function in your experience if you are not conscious of its presence. Welcome to the Voice of Yoga. We are talking consciousness. Join the Kriya Yoga Spiritual Advance to get the light in your soul and become the expression of divine will. Swami, so the name of the show today, the title is 12 Signs of Spiritual Truth, Part 5. What can you tell our listeners about why we're doing these shows?
Yeah, well, we're trying to use the Zodiac as a map for understanding what surrounds us is within us. And the Zodiac really kind of represents the changeless state of being, that it is the one divine mind. That's a very different thing than the way I think most people are using astrology, which is really focusing more on the movement of the planets. But to try and understand ourselves spiritually, it's good to have some sort of point of reference that we can turn to with scientific certainty. The stars are going to be there, and they represent the perfection of being. That is the will of the Father. Now, as we start to unbox this concept, as we start to understand ourselves from the complexity of our experience, we start to see that there are different levels of consciousness, that there are different degrees of awareness that we're working with here. But if we focus on the things that are changing all the time, as opposed to focusing on what isn't moving, then we have a tendency to believe in the things that are visible and tangible. But in truth, we really want to focus on what is invisible and intangible. And today's show, we're going to focus on Leo, which is the fifth sign of the Zodiac. And Leo is fixed fire, making Leo the second fire sign of the Zodiac because we experienced the presence of fire with Aries and the term I am. Now with Leo, which is also experienced in the second decadent of Aries, we're looking at the key phrase, I will. And as we start to, again, move from physical identity to mental identity, eventually into spiritual identity, we start to see that there is a process. And with regard to understanding of Aries, I am, we looked at that there are very different ways of interpreting that very simple phrase. And so we can look at this on a personal sense, or we can start to look at things from a more universal or absolute sense. With regard to Leo, the term I will, there's going to be my will as a personal, separate entity, and then there will be thy will, which will be the will of the one divine life, of this universe.
So we have my will, thy will. How do we know when we're operating from my will as opposed to thy will?
Yeah, that's a very difficult thing, I think, to determine. And I really kind of look to the Bible for some insight and understanding of just how do you discern, is it my will or thy will? Because one of the things that I've noticed is there are a lot of us who are under the impression that we are doing the will of the Father, that obviously this is God's will that I do this. And a lot of that really doesn't play out because we are worshiping a God that we are completely unconscious of. And the reason we know this is because we are not under the protection of divine law. So one of the significators that I use to try and determine, is this my will or is it thy will? And what really helped me understand this was when reading something by Bicknell Young, he said that human dominion is simply God's perfect law. So the will of the Father is really perfection. And that's where I think a lot of us are working with a concept of God, because we have a belief in a God that rewards and punishes. We have a belief in a God that creates and destroys, where in fact the truth of being that the one divine law, the causal spiritual dimension, is just perfect, harmonious, eternal life.
So then we will really have to assess the signs around us to determine, well, is it my will cloaked under the guise of my thinking it's thy will? So we have to really kind of drill this down to really what's the motivating part.
Yeah, and again, trying to move beyond a personal sense of I, and especially in these times where we are so self-absorbed and everything is about me and mine, my personal development, and to move beyond that and to grab a more inclusive point of identification that transcends what is visible and tangible, and even transcends the whole realm of thought. Because we do have a better understanding of the use of mind, and really we're starting to see that matter is nothing more than mind externalized as an appearance. But then what we started to talk about with Gemini was that there are modes of thinking. And to understand that there are 3 modes of mortal thought that we must at some point come out of, that we have to forsake human thinking in order for us to demonstrate divine knowing. It's not an easy catch to be able to actually give up the testimony of your 5 senses, to basically, the expression that I really always remember was release and let God. And to do that with scientific certainty, not just senseless optimism, but with a certain sense of knowing the truth, that creation is perfect, harmonious, whole, peaceful, and well, and it is under the jurisdiction and the government of divine law. To forsake the appearance of things and to hold true to the presence of that invisible, intangible, sustaining infinite is really what requires faith.
So what do you recommend that we do to wake up in the morning? How do we start our day with trying to keep our actions under the guise of thy will?
Yeah, I kind of like what the Bible tells us, what Mary Baker Eddy tells us, is to pray unceasingly. And what they mean by pray is to acknowledge the presence of this invisible, intangible, sustaining infinite, the presence of divine law, and to abide in it, and to trust that Whatever it is that you are perceiving is not backed by that law. And starting to see maybe from a more expansive sense of understanding is how mind works, that how we think is what we become. But if we continue to insist on a personal sense of thought, if we continue to work with the lower mind, the mid mind, and then even eventually the higher mind, that we will continue to be under the law of karma, which is basically a belief in two powers. But it is a very limited sense of who we are. It is a belief in mortality, which is a life that seems to have a beginning and an ending. It is our belief in it that's actually perpetuating it.
So what would that look like? We get up in the morning. Do we try to look through the person next to us or people that we meet on the street or in the grocery store? I mean, do we try to look past the physical and then try to see that there's more to them than this molecular structure?
Yeah, I think that's exactly what happens. Is first of all, you start to know yourself in the way that you're created. So you know yourself as an eternal spiritual being. When you know yourself in the same way that you are known by the Creator, that starts to activate divine law in your experience. Then basically what starts to or must happen is that your experiences have to change. If you are living out from your spiritual identity, then like attracts like, which means that everything that appears before you is spirit appearing as whatever the image is. So in other words, it's appearing as a person, it's appearing as a car, it's appearing as a tree. But when you are living out from spiritual identity, then you are acknowledging the presence of the divine in the image that's before you. And of course, not only do you activate that in your own experience, in your own self, but then it starts to materialize in your external world.
So I guess I'm just trying to put this in practical application. This sounds like a very good practice and tool that we can use when we're maybe faced with some challenging situations. Maybe being faced with some irate people in our lives or customers and things like that, but to look past what you think you see and understand, like we have said before, that the same soul that animates them animates me as well.
Right. And of course, as you start to develop the capability of understanding yourself spiritually and living out from the causal spiritual dimension, it's going to unfold in proportion to your understanding. So when we are first starting out, an irate person may appear, but actually the only reason why an irate person is appearing in your experience is because you have the belief of it in your consciousness. And rather than trying to change the external appearance, which becomes very futile and frustrating, you really start to turn within and you start to release yourself of these unnecessary beliefs, these false beliefs. And then it becomes, I want to say, a very practical guide for highly effective living. And also what starts to happen is you start to forsake this personal will for thy will, the divine law of life. And you start to harmonize yourself with the perfection of being, and you think out with divine mind as opposed to a human five-sense mind.
Now, does judgment come into play here too? Like I used the phrase an irate person. So does that have something to do with it too? Should that be a signal that I should be cautious in putting a label on a situation or a person?
Yeah, see, that is what we're going to talk about next week, which is Virgo, the discerning mind, the human power of discernment. that works on the testimony of your senses and recognizes and categorizes things based on good, bad, indifferent, and it's all what you call judgment. The biblical sense of to judge righteously really is to recognize the divine everywhere. And if everywhere you see perfection, then there should be no reaction. But if you are reacting to imperfection, it is because of your belief in it that is activating it. And so again, it's really going to come down to what you identify with and what you think is real.
All right, this is a good place to pause to hear a word from our sponsors. So listeners, we'll be back with you in just a few moments. Kriya Yoga Theory 1, Human Development and the 8 Essential Stages of Kriya Yoga. This program is a comprehensive course that will help you get your arms around the science of Kriya Yoga. It provides a clear understanding of the goals and objectives behind yoga, along with the physics of spirituality. It includes the practices, supportive concepts of Kriya Yoga, and the process in human development, apotheosis, the process of the human becoming divine. A complete guide on how to become a human in the adult state. Get the light in your soul and experience the simplicity and joy of union with the divine. This course is available in live classes at the ashram or online with 8 videos or 4 CDs. Visit our website, www.ipdtransform.com, for more information. Welcome back. For those of you just joining us, you're listening to The Voice of Yoga, and we are talking consciousness. So, Swami, what we've done in the other shows of the 12 Signs of Spiritual Truth, we also included the works of Alice Bailey and the Labors of Hercules. So let's talk about Leo, the labor of Leo with Hercules.
Yeah, in her book, she assigns the slaying of the Nemean lion to Leo, and refinement of the personality, individual but not selfish. Hercules has to close one opening to the lyre in order to capture the lion. And so we're really talking about overcoming this personal sense of I, what we identify with, and the difference between my will. Because a lot of us really are living out from personal ambition, personal desire. And that becomes one of the biggest obstacles to dominion. And to let go of a personal sense of self, I think, is kind of like slaying the Nemean lion. And I really like the image of the lion because it was always considered to be king of beasts. And I think more and more we have a tendency to be under the government of fear and limitation today because we identify with form. We have material identity, which is really governed by fear and limitation. It is under the law of karma. And to come out from under that really is a Herculean task.
So is that something you would say that should be something that we should be conscious of, is trying to capture that lion within ourselves?
Yeah, recognizing it initially, and then really also starting to understand that it's not an easy catch, that it is slippery. It comes under the form of different appearances. And so for us to recognize that it's not just my will, but then the other thing that we have to do here is instinct, appetite, preservation, and survival that comes along with physical identity. And then the other thing, which we will start to get into in some of the later shows, is what is called the higher mind or world mind. And I like what it is referred to in Revelations, the dragon, because it is the collective consciousness that most of us are individualized from. And it disguises itself as my thought. It is the shadow of your truth. It is not the truth of your being. And it's not easy to recognize whether you are being individualized from the world mind or you have acknowledged the presence of divine mind. And I think the only real indicator that you can turn to is that the Christ message, that the Christ mind heals the sick, raises the dead, reforms the sinner, that you would be under the Christ ministry, that we are all here, I think, to demonstrate divine law. Now, whether we are present, whether we are conscious of the presence of that consciousness or law is going to be very individual. But that will be the difference between my will or the imitation of thy will, and also the demonstration of the real thy will.
Well, you had mentioned about healing the sick and raising the dead, and when you talk about reforming the sinner, what exactly do we mean by that?
Well, sin is an archery term. It means missing the mark. The concept of sin really isn't about conduct. It isn't about things that we do. It is that we have accepted what is unreal and we think it's real. So we are drawing from the wrong source of sustenance. We are drawing from the wrong energy field. Biggest problem is, and that's ignorance. In yoga, we call that avidya, where we're mistaking the impermanent for the permanent. And that's where von Goethe said, none are more hopelessly enslaved than those who falsely believe that they're free.
So we're talking about sinning basically meaning that we have not put God first. So if we go throughout our day exercising my will and not thy will, we would actually be sinning.
Right.
Interesting. All right. So the other shows we talked about the constellations. So let's talk to our listeners about the constellations of Leo.
Yeah, in her book, Alice Bailey assigns Hydra the serpent as one of the constellations in Leo. The second one is Crater the cup, and the third is Corvus the raven. I think the most important rule in development is learning that personal will, personal ambition, personal intention is the biggest barrier to the divine law. Trying to understand the importance of to know God aright. That it's not just to believe in God, but to actually know God as the force right now that is supporting, sustaining, holding, and governing all of life, and doing it perfectly, harmoniously. Because a lot of us look at discord and we look at all of our challenges and problems and difficulties, and we think that these are being bestowed by God. We think that that's God's will. And that is not knowing God aright. That falls under the heading of ignorance or sin also. And so to really start to understand ourselves from the perfection of being, from a platform of being an eternal, spiritual, unchanging, indestructible, eternal life is a very different base of operation.
So we want to be able to have these tools, as we talked about before, as to how to go about life, and now we want to do so under thy will. So is it a good practice for us to pray for guidance, for God to show us thy will? And, so what does that sound like?
Yeah. The practice that we do in Kriya Yoga is called meditation, but it's the 7th stage of yoga. There's a lot of preparatory work to be able to attune yourself to the presence of what is invisible and intangible, to harmonize yourself with the will of the Father. And that really oftentimes means giving up a lot of the things that we think we know. There's a lot of human beliefs and concepts and theories that are out there that come under the heading of the world mind, which become a barrier to us understanding the presence of spirit. But to be able to reside in absolute silence, to be able to experience absolute stillness. And this is very different than the silence that we experience with regard to the absence of noise. That absolute silence is not silence that can become disturbance. And that really requires knowing the truth. It is knowing the presence of spirit correctly. And once we do that, then we make our mind an avenue of awareness for it until it speaks to us. And it's not going to speak to you in words. It's going to speak to you in its language. And that's what we pray for. That's what the Christ is what makes divine idea intelligible to the human mind. It's the converter.
So we have to be like Hercules to slay the lion so that we can overcome this belief in the physicality of what's around us.
Yeah. And in order to do this, it's not just about slaying the lion. It really requires technique. It's so helpful if you know the truth. It is really helpful if you know God aright. And you don't make the mistake and experience the misfortune of identifying the world mind for divine mind. Because oftentimes when we do that, we think we're doing the will of God, but we are unconscious to the presence of God, and then as a result, we are not under the protection of divine law. We are still under the government of the law of karma, which is the cycle of death and rebirth.
Well, I think it's about this time we have to start closing down our program for this morning. So listeners, be sure to visit our website, www.ipdtransform.com, and lots of tools on that website that you can further your spiritual development. Don't forget, 3/4 of the way down on that homepage, you'll see a section entitled Swami Says Recent Posts, and you'll see some of the Blog Talk Radio shows there listed that you can click on to continue your learning experiences. And don't forget, Swami has a free webinar that you can access this from the website as well under online classes, and that's Wednesday mornings at noon. And also look for our Facebook Live episode that we run Wednesdays at 5 p.m. So, Swami, do you have any other final thoughts about today's program?
Well, I would like to encourage people to understand the difference between my will and thy will, and not fall into the trap of thinking that thy will could be sickness, suffering, pain, discomfort, or any type of lack or limitation, that the will of the Father is absolute goodness, absolute love. And to abide in the presence of this divine law is optimal. And so with that, I'll wish everybody a good day. Namaste.
And thank you for listening to our program, The Voice of Yoga. This is Lisa Winton, along with Swami Jayananda, signing off. Have a wonderful Kriya Yoga kind of day. Namaste.